In the dead of winter, under the pale skies of Ukraine, a girl was born who would one day become a nightmare whispered to the trenches of the Eastern Front. Lyudmila Pavlichenko didn't arrive into the world with a rifle in her hands. But by the time she was in her 20s, her trigger finger had already changed the course of history. She was born in 1916 in a place that had yet to taste the full fury of World War. Growing up in Biela Tserkva, a small city near Kiev, Lyudmila was not the kind of child who played with dolls. Even as a girl, she burned with pride, stubbornness, and the kind of fierce energy that refused to be boxed in. When a neighborhood boy boasted he could outshoot any girl in the district, Lyudmila picked up a rifle to shut him up, and did. It wasn't just a lucky shot. It was instinct. A frightening, natural precision that would haunt the dreams of enemy soldiers years later. But long before her name was etched into enemy fear and military history, Lyudmila was just a student with aspirations. She enrolled in Kiev University to study history. Books, lectures, and libraries were meant to be her future, not blood and bullet casings. But in 1941, the Nazi war machine rolled eastward. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's massive invasion of the Soviet Union, ripped through peaceful towns and cities like a wildfire through dry brush. Suddenly, everything changed. No one was safe, and the front lines came too close to ignore. This is the moment where most people freeze. They wait. They hope it'll pass. But not Lyudmila. She marched to a Soviet recruitment office and demanded to join the fight. At first, they laughed. A woman? A student? Go be a nurse, they said. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She handed them her marksman certificate, earned from a local sharpshooting club, and insisted on combat. They gave her a rifle. In those first brutal months of the war, Lyudmila Pavlichenko wasn't given special treatment. She wasn't dropped behind enemy lines with a red carpet or fanfare. She was sent to the front with the 25th Rifle Division, a standard Mosin-Nagant rifle in her hands, and only her instincts to rely on. Her first 2 kills came almost immediately, not in a dramatic firefight, not after hours of crawling through underbrush. She simply spotted 2 German soldiers through her scope, pulled the trigger twice, and history began keeping count. What made Lyudmila lethal wasn't just her accuracy. It was her patience, her cold, almost clinical ability to wait in the mud for hours, sometimes days, for a perfect shot. She blended with the forest, the rubble, the ruins. She became invisible. And when her bullet found a target, there was no warning. No echo of a shot. Just death. As her kill count climbed, so did her reputation. She didn't just survive, she excelled. Within months, she wasn't just one of the most feared snipers in her division. She was one of the most feared snipers in the entire war. But her targets weren't always rank-and-file infantry. German command eventually became aware of the woman, who was turning their men into corpses. So they sent their own snipers, experts, trained killers, just to take her out. She killed every one of them. There's one story that stands out. It's not folklore. It's confirmed. Lyudmila engaged in a sniper duel that lasted 3 days. 3 days of crawling, hiding, guessing, waiting. 1 shot, and you're dead. No second chances. On the 3rd day, she spotted the enemy. 1 shot, another kill, and silence once again. But the silence didn't last long. As her tally grew 100, 150, 200, the Soviet military began to understand what she represented. Not just a weapon, but a symbol. A woman, barely in her 20s, striking fear into the heart of an army that believed itself invincible. They gave her better equipment. She upgraded to a Tokarev SVT-40 with a 3.5x PU scope, and the kills kept coming. Lyudmila was invincible, but she came close. She was wounded multiple times, shrapnel, concussions, but returned to front every time, until one injury forced her out permanently. But even then, the war hadn't seen the last of her. When they finally pulled her from the battlefield, she had 309 confirmed kills. And that's confirmed, not estimated, not guessed. These were bodies, each one recorded, each one a life taken because she was faster, colder, more precise. But numbers don't tell the whole story. These weren't just kills. They were battles, duels, moments where her breath held steady and her heart slowed just enough to squeeze the trigger without shaking. This was no longer the history student from Kiev. This was Lady Death, and her war had only just begun. By the summer of 1942, the Eastern Front was soaked in blood. Entire cities had been turned to ashes, and Soviet soldiers were fighting not just for land, but for the survival of their people. Somewhere in that chaos, Lyudmila Pavlichenko had already written her legend with gunpowder and grit. 309 confirmed kills. The most successful female sniper in recorded history. The Germans had given her a name they uttered with a mix of awe and terror, Lady Death. But death does not leave its messengers unscarred. During a brutal battle near Sevastopol, a mortar shell exploded close to her position. Shrapnel tore through the dirt, shredding her uniform and driving fragments deep into her skin. She didn't cry out. She never did. She pressed her hands against the wound, trying to stay conscious long enough to be dragged from the field. It took days to stabilize her. For the first time in months, she wasn't in the mud or snow. She was in a hospital bed, listening to distant artillery echo across the horizon like thunder. When she finally opened her eyes, doctors told her she wouldn't be returning to the front. Her body was too damaged, but she was still a weapon, just not the kind that fired bullets anymore. The Soviet command understood something profound. Lyudmila Pavlichenko had become a story, and stories could rally nations in ways even armies couldn't. So instead of sending her back to the trenches, they sent her across oceans. In 1942, Lyudmila became part of a Soviet delegation touring Allied nations, the United States, Canada, and Great Britain. She was 25 years old, still healing from her wounds, and carrying more emotional weight than anyone her age should. When she boarded the ship bound for America, she wasn't sure what awaited her. She'd seen death up close. She'd buried friends, endured the unthinkable. And now, she was supposed to smile for cameras, shake hands, and inspire nations half a world away from the front line. When she arrived in Washington, the reception was something she could never have imagined. A small-framed woman in a crisp military uniform, her chest heavy with medals, she stood before crowds that had only read about the horrors she had lived through. She was introduced to President Franklin D. Roosevelt and, more importantly, befriended First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, a woman who instantly saw in Lyudmila a kindred spirit of strength and conviction. They traveled together across America, city after city, rally after rally. And everywhere she went, Lyudmila faced the same question. Softened smiles, polite curiosity, reporters more interested in her lipstick and uniform than her story. Do you wear makeup on the front lines? Do you curl your hair before battle? It was as if her record-breaking achievements had to be filtered through the lens of being a woman. She endured it quietly at first. But one day, standing before an audience of thousands in Chicago, she decided she had heard enough. She stepped to the microphone. Her eyes swept across the crowd. Her voice, steady and cold as a sniper's breath, cut through the chatter. Gentlemen, I am 25 years old, and I have killed 309 fascist occupants. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long? The crowd erupted. Thunderous applause. Cheers. Shouts that shook the rafters. In that moment, Lady Death became something more than a soldier. She became a symbol of defiance, of courage, of the shared burden between nations. She wasn't asking for pity. She was demanding responsibility. Lyudmila's speech electrified the press. Overnight, she became a global sensation. Newspaper headlines in New York, London, and Ottawa carried her words. She was featured in parades, interviews, and photo shoots. But even then, she never played the celebrity. She spoke only of duty, of fallen comrades, of the women still fighting and dying on the front line she had left behind. Behind the camera flashes, though, the weight never left her shoulders. The laughter of American soldiers in polished uniforms, the jazz bands in hotel lobbies, the neon lights of cities untouched by war, all of it felt surreal. She often stared out her window at night, thinking about Sevastopol, about the echo of rifle fire, about the faces she would never see again. In private moments, Eleanor Roosevelt noticed the pain behind her friend's steel exterior. The two women spent long evenings talking quietly, sharing thoughts about war, loss, and purpose. For Lyudmila, Eleanor's friendship was a rare comfort, a reminder that compassion still had a place in a world consumed by violence. After the United States, Lyudmila traveled to Canada and Great Britain, repeating her mission to build solidarity, to remind the Allies that every delay cost Soviet lives. And slowly, her words began to shift public perception. The Western press, which had initially treated her like a curiosity, started portraying her as a heroine, a living symbol of resistance. By the time her tour ended, she had done something no bullet could. She had awakened empathy. She had reminded the world that courage has no gender, and that war does not forgive indifference. When Lyudmila finally returned to the Soviet Union, she was exhausted, older somehow, though not in years. The front lines had changed. The tide of war was beginning to turn, but she would never fight again. Her rifle, the same one that had ended hundreds of lives, was placed in a museum. Still, she wasn't forgotten. She became an instructor for young snipers, passing on everything she knew. Her students would carry her techniques into battle, many never returning, but their precision kept her legacy alive. In the years after the war, she struggled with what soldiers now call the silence. No more rifles cracking in the distance, no comrades' laughter over a campfire, no heartbeat racing behind the crosshairs. Just silence. She completed her history degree, wrote memoirs, and served as a historian for the Soviet Navy. But those who knew her said the war never really left her eyes. When asked about her record, she would sometimes smile faintly, then look away. Because the truth is, every one of those 309 kills came with a cost. Lyudmila Pavlichenko wasn't born a killer. She became one because she had to, and in doing so, she became a legend, not for the death she caused, but for the life she chose to live in defiance of everything that tried to destroy her. Her final years were quiet. She lived long enough to see the world remember her not as a weapon, but as a woman who changed history. A woman who reminded us that courage is not measured in medals or kills, but in the choices made when the world demands impossible things. And when she died in 1974, she was buried with full military honors. Across her homeland, veterans saluted her name. In the West, her story was told in books, songs, and documentaries. But perhaps the most fitting tribute remains the whisper carried across battlefields long after she was gone. Lady Death never missed. History often forgets the quiet years, the decades after bombs stopped falling, the years where battlefields turn into farmland again, where ruins become neighborhoods, and the echoes of war fade into textbooks. But some legacies don't fade. Some names keep pulsing through time, whispered in classrooms, carved into monuments, retold by generations trying to grasp the kind of strength they can barely imagine. Lyudmila Pavlichenko's war ended in 1942, but her story was far from over. When she returned from her tour across Allied nations, she did not become a politician or celebrity. She didn't cash in her fame or posture before the camera. She went back to her roots, education, history, and service. But even in the quiet of post-war life, she remained a symbol of something far greater than herself. She completed her degree at Kiev University and later worked as a research assistant at the Soviet Navy headquarters. A civilian now, she spent her days with books and her nights with memories. But she didn't disappear into anonymity. She spoke at veteran events. She trained new generations of snipers. She wrote about her experiences not with bravado, but with an aching honesty that revealed the real toll war. Not just the killing, but the survival. She never forgot the women who fought beside her. See, Lyudmila was part of something larger, something radical for its time. The Soviet Union was the only major power in World War II to deploy women in direct combat roles, not just nurses or clerks, snipers, machine gunners, pilots, tank commanders. By the end of the war, more than 2,000 Soviet women had served as snipers. Of those, only about 500 survived. It was brutal, unforgiving, and often thankless. But Lyudmila's success and the visibility of her achievements made her a beacon for all of them. She proved that women were not just capable, they were essential. Her presence in wartime propaganda wasn't just a morale booster. It was a cultural shift. Posters showed her standing tall in uniform, rifle slung over her shoulder, eyes sharp with purpose. She wasn't sexualized. She wasn't diminished. She was depicted as a soldier, a patriot, an equal. That mattered, especially in a world where most military history was written by and for men. But with time, the Cold War began to rewrite the narratives. In the West, Soviet stories were often erased or twisted. Heroes became propaganda, and Lady Death faded into the shadows of collective memory, remembered in Russia, but largely forgotten elsewhere. It wasn't until decades later, as historians began piecing together forgotten chapters of World War II, that Lyudmila's name resurfaced in the global conversation. Documentaries started mentioning her. Authors found her memoirs and published translations. Military analysts revisited her record, and slowly, she reclaimed her space, not just as a Soviet icon, but as one of the greatest snipers the world has ever known, regardless of gender. But the legacy she left wasn't just military. It was human. In every soldier she trained, in every young girl who heard her story and realized that courage isn't exclusive to men, she left behind a quiet revolution. She shattered stereotypes not by arguing against them, but by living beyond them. In post-war interviews, she rarely glorified combat. She spoke about the weight of it, the toll it took on her soul. She admitted she often dreamed of the faces she never got to see again. Not just friends, enemies too, because war doesn't just scar the body. It carves lines deep into the spirit. And that's the paradox of her story. She was called Lady Death, but she didn't worship death. She respected life, so much so that she was willing to kill to protect it. That's not something the average person can understand. But for Lyudmila, that contradiction was a reality. Every time she squeezed a trigger, it was for someone she would never meet, for a future she wasn't sure she'd live to see. Today, her story is taught in military academies. Her name appears in feminist histories. She's been portrayed in films, dramatizations, and honored in modern Russia with commemorative stamps and exhibitions. Even songs have been written in her memory, including one by American folk singer Woody Guthrie during the war itself, an ode to the woman who made the enemy shiver behind every tree. But beyond the medals and the music, there's a simple truth. Lyudmila Pavlichenko wasn't fighting to be remembered. She was fighting so others could live. That's what makes her legacy so potent. In an age where war is often sanitized and heroism repackaged into digestible sound bites, Lyudmila's life remains raw. She didn't ask to be exceptional. She was forged by the world around her, shaped by necessity, and driven by a quiet, relentless will to do what had to be done. She's not just a page in a history book. She's a reminder that courage wears many faces, that sometimes the sharpest weapon in war isn't a tank or a bomb, but a single person with unwavering focus, that some of the fiercest warriors in history never shouted their names. They whispered them into the scope of a rifle and let the silence speak for them. And maybe that's how she'd want to be remembered, not as a killer, not even as a hero, but as someone who stood when others fell, who aimed not for glory, but for peace, who understood that in the ugliest moments of history, the truest kind of strength doesn't roar. It waits, breathes, and never misses. Decades have passed since Lyudmila Pavlichenko last held a rifle, but her story never settled into dust. It lingers, not just in old photographs or military records, but in the shadows of every modern battlefield where women now serve, no longer as an anomaly, but as a force. Her name, for a long time buried under layers of Cold War tension and shifting political tides, has begun to reemerge, not as a relic, but as a symbol of everything that makes war history and heroism more complex than we want to believe. For much of the 20th century, history books in the West left her out. It wasn't just Lyudmila. They left out the thousands of women who fought in the Red Army, the nurses who died with their patients, the partisans who detonated bridges in the dead of night. The narrative was sanitized, simplified. The war, as told in many textbooks, was a man's war. But the truth always has a way of resurfacing. In recent years, as historians and journalists have begun peeling back the layers of propaganda myth, the name Lyudmila Pavlichenko has returned to the conversation with force. And this time, it's not just a number, 309 kills, that defines her. It's the humanity beneath the uniform. Modern documentaries now explore the psyche of the sniper, what it meant for someone barely out of university to become an instrument of war. Psychological studies reference her not just as a case of resilience, but as an example of what trauma looks like when it's carried in silence. Soldiers today, both men and women, read about her in tactical training, not because she was a novelty, but because she was simply the best at what she did. And then there's the cultural shift. Today, when a female soldier graduates from sniper school in any country, from the United States to Israel, from Ukraine to Canada, Lyudmila's name often surfaces, not always directly, but in whispers, in inspiration, in legacy. She's not idolized blindly, but she's honored with clarity, because those who understand war know that greatness doesn't come from the body count. It comes from choosing to stand when standing costs everything. In popular culture, her legend has been slowly embraced. Video games reference her. Films borrow her silhouette. Academic essays explore her speeches. That moment in Chicago, when she called out the crowd, "Don't you think you've been hiding behind my back for too long?" has become more than just a quote. It's a challenge, a rallying cry, a reminder that bravery doesn't come from appearance or rank, but from action. And her story now matters in ways she could never have predicted. In an age when disinformation spreads like wildfire and the lines between war and politics blur into chaos, Lyudmila Pavlichenko offers something rare: clarity. She didn't fight for ideology. She fought because she had to, because her country was burning, because every inch of land lost meant more families erased, more futures turned to ash. Her purpose was survival. Her weapon was skill. Her armor was willpower. There's something else, too, something quieter. Lyudmila's life speaks not just of battlefield, but to the aftermath. She lived through the trauma. She endured the fame. And in the end, she returned to her first love, history, not as a subject to memorize, but as a truth to protect. She spent her later years walking among students and sailors, teaching them not just tactics or facts, but the weight of what it means to live through war, to come out the other side changed, scarred, wiser, and still standing. She never remarried, never wrote a tell-all, never sold her story for profit. There's a purity to that, a rare kind of humility in a world obsessed with legacy and name. Lyudmila didn't chase fame. It followed her, but she never let it define her. Today, her grave in Moscow is visited by soldiers, students, and historians. Some leave flowers. Some just stand in silence. And some bring their daughters, pointing to name carved in stone and whispering stories about the woman who stared into the eyes of war and never blinked. So what remains of Lyudmila Pavlichenko? Not just 309 kills, not just a nickname whispered by enemies, but a legacy that bridges history and humanity. She showed the world that courage isn't always loud, that some wars are won not by sheer force, but by resolve, that sometimes the most powerful act of defiance is choosing to do what's right, even when no one believes you can. She didn't set out to be a legend. She became one anyway, and the world, all these years later, is still catching up to her shadow.